So we have our finished armature here, and I am going to be working in Sculpting medium on this figure. But before jumping into the Sculpey, I want to show you how I line my armatures with Epoxy Sculpt. So you could, in theory, just jump into Sculpey at this stage. But what happens with that is that Sculpey is a little bit on the brittle side after it's baked. Having the armature underneath does help keep it strong, but since this armature is fairly pliable, the clay can crack on top of it. So either when you bake it in the oven and it starts cooling down, sometimes the metal and the clay have different cooling rates, and that can cause cracks. Additionally, if the sculpture falls or gets knocked over after baking, having the epoxy sculpt over the armature can help absorb some of that impact, and there'll be less chance of breakage. So this is basically an extra step just to make everything stronger. Oh, I also forgot to point out that as you're working on the sculpture, having the epoxy sculpt base can really make things a lot easier. Rather than having a big ball of Sculpey kind of squishing around, you've got something nice and solid under there to push against, so it just makes it easier to work with the clay on the Sculpey on top of the cured epoxy sculpt. So let's go ahead and get started on that. Get the armature out of the way for a second. So I've got my epoxy sculpt here. You will want to use some rubber gloves. I use nitrile gloves. You could also use vinyl. I wouldn't recommend latex because that stuff just falls apart really easily and it's gross. So what I'm going to do is take out some of part A. Just kind of pinch it out of there. I'm not going to use a ton right now. I prefer to do this in batches. If I need to go back and mix more later, I will. But I don't like to waste clay. That stuff is not cheap, so. I like to have something down to protect my work surface. Right now I'm just using the backside of the armature map. So this stuff, once it cures, it sticks to everything. Everything, whether you want it there or not, it's not going away. All right, so it doesn't need to be exact, but, relative. Equal portions of part A and B. All right, so then we're just going to mix those together. Once again, you don't need to use Epoxy Sculpt brand. If you're using another brand of epoxy clay, that's totally fine, especially if you're just going to be lining the armatures and not sculpting with it. Even plumber's putty will work for this. Now, if you are using something like plumber's putty, that stuff is a little more on the toxic side. It's got fumes coming off of it, so make sure you're using that under good ventilation, and definitely using gloves. So regardless of what brand you're using, the two parts will always be two different colors, so you can tell when they are thoroughly mixed. You won't see any streaks anymore. So once it starts to become a pretty even color is when you can stop and use it. It's not going to cure super fast, so you have a little working time. You definitely don't want to set this down and go off and make some coffee. And when you're sitting down to work with Epoxy Sculpt, make sure you've got time to sit and work with it till you're done. Okay, so we're going to take the armature here and just take small pieces of Epoxy Sculpt and start pressing them into place. Okay, make sure it's nice and tight around the armature there. Yeah, on this first pass, I like to just make sure I'm getting the armature covered. Relatively evenly. In regards to the limbs, what I do on the first pass is I leave the joints open still, so I can still bend them a little bit. It gives me a little flexibility with the pose. I do that because so many times I have just covered the whole armature with epoxy, and then when I start sculpting, I realize I want to modify the pose a little bit. So I've gotten to the point where I just give myself a little more wiggle room from the start and just leave those joints open, because you can always go back and fill them in. It's easier to do that than to have to break the cured clay and fix it so it's able to be reposed. Okay, so you don't want to go too thick with the clay, especially around the limbs, because you want to think about the fact that you're going to have Sculpey on top of this. So especially around like where the wrists are and that sort of thing, you want to make sure it's pretty thin. I'm going to do the same with the neck. Just that. Actually, I am going to connect the neck to the body. Not doing anything fancy with that. Okay, just kind of pinch there to create a separation. And now, once this cures, I'll be able to bend that. I generally will do this first layer of epoxy sculpt, let it cure for like a couple hours or till the next day, and then go back and do a second layer. I know that can be a little frustrating if you just want to jump into it, but taking the time to do that and just make sure your structure is sound will save you a lot of time further along. And if you're doing more detail, these gloves can just get in the way, and honestly, I do end up taking them off when I'm doing more detail work, but I do try to wear them as much as possible. If for nothing else, this stuff just sticks to your skin. It'll get stuck under your nails. It's kind of gross. But it's really not good for your skin either. You can develop allergies if you have too much exposure to it, and you don't want that. You might have an allergy already. You don't really want to find out. So try to get in the habit of using the gloves. It's a pain, but your safety and health are important. Okay. I've seen artists, they'll do the epoxy sculpt all in one go, and that's it. If you have that ability / confidence, go for it. Whenever I do that, I always end up going back and making revisions. So this is just easier for me, and this way is more conducive to my style and my workflow, so that's what I do. You don't need to take what I'm saying as like a steadfast rule. This is just my own process and sharing with you what has worked for me and what hasn't worked. That may not necessarily be true in your case. So I still got to go back and do the front paws. I have to trim those down a little bit. I can tell. I'm testing the the stance as I go along, especially since this is a freestanding figure. There's not going to be a base. I want to make sure that he's able to stand on his 4 feet without any issue. Okay, notice that I am continuously turning this to make sure I've got the proportions right. Make sure it's nice and thin from multiple angles, not just from the side. And I will show you how to correct any mistakes that you might make with the epoxy sculpt. So if you need to go back and shave down a little, that is doable. So I don't want you to think like, oh no, if I make a mistake, it's completely irreversible. It is reversible, it's just destructive. So, if you can avoid it by taking a little extra time from the start, that's preferable. I am gonna go and trim this off because that's just a little too bulky. Okay, and I want to be able to go back and sculpt the toes on there. All right, let's get the second foot. As this is curing, epoxy sculpt goes through different stages. The first hour, half hour, it's pretty pliable and you can be putting on large shapes onto the armature like this. After an hour, 2 hours, you'll notice it's starting to get kind of leathery. That's a really good stage for you to go back and make modifications. Like if you see maybe this leg is too thick, you can go in with an X-Acto blade and just kind of shave some of that off. That's easier to do during that kind of leather hard stage than it is right now when it's still really soft. You just want to make sure to wait for your sculpture to get into that stage without it getting too hard. And the tail's another one. I'm just going to go ahead and attach it to the body. I'm not too worried about that one. And you may be looking at your sculpture at this point and being like, wow, this looks really weird. The proportions seem weird, and that's just because it's, you're not putting on the full forms just yet. You're just creating this protective first layer. So don't be too judgmental. All right. So he can stand on his own, that's good. He's looking pretty even. Make sure all 4 feet are touching. That's good. He's generally in the position I want him to be from every angle. So I've got a little bit of extra clay here that I'm just gonna, oops, got the tip to one of the feet there. Don't want that. I'm just gonna take this and attach it to the chest area because that's always going to be an area that's a little bit on the bulkier side. Okay. So at this point, I've got the whole armature covered. I'm going to let this set up for maybe an hour or so, and then come back to it and make some modifications and add a little bit more. My armature has been curing for a little bit. It's still a little soft and pliable, but it's got much less give to it than it did when I first applied the clay. So I'm going to take this time now to just kind of check over and make sure everything's posed the way I want it to be. Actually, pretty happy with this. I'm going to shave off just a little bit. So if you need to pare down your clay at all, just take an X-Acto blade and you can just sort of scrape away some of that. Just go slowly. It just kind of slips right off there. And you can even pinch and reform it a little bit. Keep an eye on the clay as it's curing, or it'll zoom past this stage real fast, and you just won't be able to do much with it at all. Okay. Another thing you might want to do is add a little texture to the clay, either just by adding in some dots like that, or streaks, or some sort of texture that will help the Sculpey adhere, give it a little more tooth to grab onto. You can just go in with your nails even and do that. Just something to break up the surface a little bit. Sometimes it's easier to do it in that first stage. I had the tool pulled out and I forgot to do it anyway. I'm actually going to go ahead and clip off the end of that tail. Get that out of the way. I'm texturing the spots where I'm not probably going to be adding any more epoxy. Because where I'm going to add more epoxy, I can texture that next layer of clay that I'm going to put on. Okay. If you find that the clay is a little too sticky, just use a little bit of water to help you along. I will definitely be doing that once I get into actually sculpting with this. Just right now, I'm fine without the water. So it can definitely help with the tackiness. You just don't want to use too much or it'll kind of start melting almost and get really messy and drippy. So if you use water, you don't want to go overboard with it. Okay, and once again, we're just going to mix this up until you don't see any streaks left. And this is going to be my last round of epoxy sculpt on this guy. After that, I'm going to be moving into Sculpey. So again, just simply reinforcing the armature here and giving myself a base to work off of. And this is going to help prevent breaks in the sculpture, and it's going to make it a lot easier to lay details down. Alright, so I'm going to start laying this into the chest and torso area and just sort of thicken that up a little bit. In the past, I used aluminum foil to bulk out armatures. I've since pretty much stopped using aluminum foil just because I found it shifts around a lot and it's kind of a pain to keep in place, but that is an option if you want to use that. Just for myself personally, I've gotten away from doing that. I've also found when you bake sculptures that have foil in them, especially like really thick layers of foil with a thin layer of Sculpey on top, the Sculpey is much more likely to crack because as the clay and foil are cooling at different rates, the foil can contract before the clay and just end up causing cracks along the clay because there's nothing under there to support it. I'm gonna double check on there. All right. So just looking at, like, comparing this to the drawing, I've got a good 1/4 inch or so around where I'm going to be putting clay on top. That's really as far as I need to go. There's just no need to go crazy with it. And I'm just reinforcing around the shoulders a little bit there. I try to keep the joints like reinforced, but without like totally locking them into place in case I want to go back and make changes, especially I found around the shoulder. I tend to go back and make changes, so try to keep it loose around there. So just giving this another look, I think I am going to mix up a little bit more and just reinforce around the shoulders and hips a little bit, because like if you think about where the weight is distributed, any stress point in the sculpture, you really want to reinforce a bit, you know, like ankles and knees and hips, and just like in real life, all those pressure points that you don't want to break. Just adding a little bit more clay in there to make sure that they're nice and sturdy and they're not going to break during sculpting or once the sculpture is baked. I'm just looking at the tail too. I kind of want to add a little swoop at the end while I'm thinking of it. It's a little too straight there for me. I always end up modifying as I'm just sitting here looking at it. This is kind of why I like to leave the joints free, because I always end up just slightly reposing, especially once I start getting like the bulk in and I start seeing things relative to each other. Even when I get this last layer on, I'll make some final adjustments to the pose. Just real quick. Look at that. Kind of lost some of the exaggeration in it. That's a little bit better now. All right. So we've got this last bit of epoxy I want to get on there. And I'm going to go up around the shoulders and add a little bit more around there on the chest. Just make sure that shoulder's kind of got a good socket that it's resting in. And notice I'm not really worrying about smoothing it in. Again, just laying this on in this manner with all those cracks and seams and such, that's gonna help add texture to help the Sculpey adhere when we get to that stage. And this, I want to make it a little more cohesive there. That leg was looking a little weird. Yeah, it's much better. This is why I like to go in stages. You have that first layer that's a little bit harder and it gives you something to work against rather than just mushing a bunch of squishy epoxy sculpt and trying to get these shapes. I've really found doing it in layers and slowly building it up is really the way to go. Again, I know sometimes that's hard to do, to slow down and take your time, but ends up being worth it. All right, that's much better. Double check the pose again, make sure I didn't shift that around too much. Especially like to check it from the front to make sure he's not crooked. This is a relatively linear pose, not doing anything crazy here, so to make sure everything's nice and even from each side. Turn that foot out a little more. See, I make those final adjustments before the clay starts setting up. All right, and then I'm just gonna go in, a few more bits there. Go in with my rubber tool and add a little texture. There's already some texture on there, but this will help get a little bit more. Doesn't need to be anything fancy. This is going to be all covered up in the next stage, so just kind of want to break up that smooth, shiny texture a bit. As much as you can. Okay. I guess it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it doesn't matter because what matters at this point is your structure. Add a little more. I'm just pinching the neck with my fingernails a little bit to add a little texture on there. Looks like a weird headless tiger right now. All right. Now that I've got all my epoxy in place, I'm going to go ahead and let this cure for 24 hours. And then it's going to be ready for my Sculpting.